They told her the Americans would shoot German medical staff on sight. No questions, no mercy, just bullets. But when 27-year-old Liesel Brenner stood frozen in the ruins of the Pfaffenhofen Field Hospital on April 28, 1945, watching U.S. soldiers burst through the shattered doors, the enemy did not raise their rifles. Instead, a blood-soaked sergeant, with exhaustion carved into his face, locked eyes with her and said words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about war, about enemies, about the thin line between mercy and survival. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the moment before everything changed. The waiting. The morning had started like all the others that terrible April, with the smell of death and disinfectant and the distant thunder of artillery that never seemed to stop. Liesel stood at the window of what had once been a schoolhouse, her fingers gripping the splintered frame so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The glass was long gone, blown out weeks ago by a mortar that had landed in the courtyard. Now cold Bavarian air poured through the opening, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning diesel and cordite. The Americans were close. Everyone knew it. You could hear it in the way the explosions had changed pitch over the last 2 days, sharper now, closer, the distinctive crack of American rifles mixing with the deeper boom of their tanks. Behind her, the field hospital was a scene from a nightmare that had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. 28 wounded German soldiers lay on makeshift cots, wooden planks covered with whatever fabric could be found. Some moaned softly, others lay in that terrible silence that meant they were either unconscious or too far gone to cry out. The floor was sticky with dried blood that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The walls painted yellow, when this had been a place where children learned arithmetic and geography, were now stained with smoke and streaked with God knows what. Shelves that once held books now held precious vials of morphine, rolls of bandages made from torn bed sheets, and surgical instruments that had been sterilized so many times they were losing their edge. Liesel hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the last 48. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes. Her blonde hair, which regulations said should be pinned neatly beneath her nurse's cap, hung in loose strands around her face. The pins had been lost days ago, and there were no more to be had. Her white uniform, once pristine, a symbol of order and professionalism, was now permanently stained with rust-colored splotches that no washing could remove. Blood, so much blood. German blood soaking into fabric, into wood, into her very soul. Liesel, she turned. Dr. Friedrich stood behind her, his 62 years showing in every line of his weathered face. He had been a surgeon in Berlin before the war, well-respected, comfortable. Now he was old before his time, his hands trembling as he held a white pillowcase tied to a broom handle. "They're here," he said quietly in German. "I can see their tanks from the east window. We have perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less." Liesel nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I will surrender the hospital." Dr. Friedrich continued, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "I will tell them we are medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention. I will tell them we have only wounded here." He paused. "What happens after that, I do not know." Across the room, Margaret, the head nurse at 48, a woman who had lost her only son at Stalingrad, clutched a small silver cross in her hands, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her eyes were closed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Liesel wanted to pray too, but the words wouldn't come. She had prayed so many times in the last 3 years, prayed for her patients, prayed for the war to end, prayed for her brother, Stefan. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Stefan, 19 years old, with his easy laugh and his stupid jokes and his absolute certainty that the war was wrong, that Hitler was leading Germany to ruin. Stefan, who had spoken too loudly, trusted the wrong person, been arrested by the Gestapo 6 months ago. Stefan, who had died in a cell before Liesel could even say goodbye. She blinked hard, forcing the image away. There was no time for grief. There never was. The rumble of engines grew louder. Liesel could feel it through the floorboards, now a vibration that made the surgical instruments rattle on their tray. Positions, Dr. Friedrich said, though there were no positions to take. What were they supposed to do? Line up to be executed more efficiently. The propaganda had been clear. The Americans were barbarians. They took no prisoners when they found German medical staff. They considered nurses and doctors collaborators, enablers of the war machine. They would. The doors exploded inward with a crash that made everyone jump. The breach. Bright daylight flooded the dim hospital like a physical force. Liesel threw up her arm to shield her eyes, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. When her vision adjusted, she saw them. American soldiers silhouetted against the morning sun, rifles, raised helmets shadowing their faces. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before, sweeping through the room, checking corners, covering angles. Liesel couldn't breathe. This was it. This was how it ended. But the bullets didn't come. Instead, the soldiers moved methodically through the space rifles, lowering as they confirmed what Dr. Friedrich had said: only wounded here, no armed resistance, no trap. The German soldiers who could move raised their hands in surrender. Some cried out in fear. One elderly corporal with both legs in splints began to weep. Dr. Friedrich stepped forward, hands raised high, the white pillowcase fluttering. "We are medical personnel," he said in heavily accented but clear English. "Geneva Convention. We have wounded only. Please, we surrender." The lead soldier, a young private with a baby face and mud-caked uniform, nodded curtly. "Secure the room," he barked to his squad. "Check everyone. Watch for weapons." Then the sergeant entered. Liesel saw him immediately, not because he was larger than the others or more intimidating, but because of the blood. It soaked his left side dark and wet, spreading across his olive-drab uniform beneath his unbuttoned jacket. He moved stiffly, one arm pressed against his ribs, his face pale beneath his helmet and 3 days of stubble. Behind him, 2 soldiers half carried, half dragged another American. This man was unconscious, his head lolling, blood streaming from a massive wound in his upper chest and shoulder. His breathing was shallow, ragged, the terrible wet sound of a damaged lung. Even from across the room, Liesel's medical training kicked in. Tension, pneumothorax, possible hemothorax, blood loss severe, without immediate intervention, death. The sergeant's eyes swept the hospital ward, taking in the wounded Germans, the makeshift operating table, the shelves of medical supplies. Then his gaze locked onto Liesel. She stood out, the only woman, the only one in a nurse's uniform. For a long moment they stared at each other across the chaos and the fear and the weight of 3 years of war. His eyes were brown, she noticed, tired, haunted, but not cruel. He took 3 steps toward her, wincing with each movement. His men tense, rifles ready, watching every German in the room for any sign of threat. The sergeant stopped 5 feet away from Liesel, close enough that she could see the sweat cutting tracks through the dirt on his face, close enough to see the way his hand shook slightly as he pressed it against his wounded side. "You," he said in English, his voice rough. "You're a nurse." It wasn't a question. But Liesel nodded anyway, her throat too dry to speak. The sergeant gestured toward the man his soldiers had carried in, now lying on the floor just inside the doorway in a spreading pool of his own blood. "We need help," he said. "Our medic is dead. This man," his voice cracked slightly, "he's dying." Liesel's mind went blank. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The enemy was supposed to kill her. They were supposed to be monsters. They weren't supposed to ask. They weren't supposed to need. The sergeant must have seen the confusion on her face, because he did something that shattered every piece of propaganda Liesel had ever heard. He lowered his rifle, set it against the wall, raised his empty hands. "Please," he said, and the desperation in that single word cut through everything else. "Please help him." Liesel opened her mouth, closed it. Her brain couldn't process what was happening. An American soldier the enemy was asking, not ordering, not threatening, asking. The sergeant seemed to realize she was in shock. He took a half step closer, and Liesel saw that his hands were shaking too. "His name is Robert Mitchell," the sergeant said, words tumbling out now. "He's 24. He has 2 little girls back in Oklahoma, daughters." He swallowed hard. "He's been with us since D-Day. He's my friend, and he's dying." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice broke. "Please, will you help us?" Liesel looked past him at the wounded American on the floor. Blood bubbled from his chest with each struggling breath. She could see it from here. The wound was catastrophic. Without immediate surgery, he had maybe 10 minutes. She thought of Stefan, of all the times she'd wished someone, anyone, had shown him mercy. She thought of the 2 little girls in Oklahoma who might grow up without a father. She thought of her oath taken so long ago it felt like a lifetime. First do no harm. And she thought of the choice in front of her. She could refuse. She could say he was the enemy, that his friends had destroyed her country, killed her brother. She could let him die and no one would blame her. Or she could be a nurse, just a nurse, nothing more, nothing less. Liesel found her voice. "I do not speak English well," she said carefully, her accent heavy. "You speak it fine," the sergeant said quickly. "Will you help him?" Liesel looked at Dr. Friedrich. The old man stood, frozen hands still raised, watching. After a long moment, he gave a single tiny nod. Permission, or perhaps understanding. Liesel looked back at the sergeant, at his brown eyes filled with desperate hope, at the blood soaking through his uniform, at the dying man behind him. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, switching to rapid German. "Margaret, get him on the table. Morphine, bandages, surgical kit. Now." The sergeant sagged with relief so profound it looked like his knees might buckle. "Thank you," he breathed. "God, thank you." He turned and barked orders in English to his men. They carefully lifted Robert Mitchell and carried him to the examination table in the center of the room, sweeping aside instruments and supplies. And just like that, the war stopped at the door of the Pfaffenhofen Field Hospital. Liesel Brenner had made her choice. She had no idea it was only the first of many. The first wound. Liesel approached the operating table with her heart in her throat. Up close, Robert Mitchell looked impossibly young. Dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, a square jaw, freckles across his nose that made him look like a boy playing soldier. His uniform had been cut away from the wound, revealing a ragged hole in his upper chest just below his right collarbone. The bullet had gone through. She could see the exit wound in his back, larger, messier blood welling up with each shallow breath. Lung damage, certainly, possibly worse. "I need to stop the bleeding," Liesel said, forcing herself to speak clearly despite her accent and the adrenaline making her hands shake. She pointed to the supply cabinet. "They're gauze bandages, morphine. He needs morphine." The sergeant nodded to one of his men. "Bennett, help her." A young corporal moved to the cabinet, and Liesel walked over, acutely aware that American rifles still tracked her every movement. She pulled out what she needed: rolls of gauze, a bottle of iodine, a precious vial of morphine that was meant for German wounded needles. Her hands steadied as she fell into the familiar rhythm of medical work. This she knew, this she could do. When she returned to the table, she injected the morphine first. Mitchell didn't even flinch. He was too far gone, hovering in that gray space between consciousness and death. "This is very bad," Liesel said, pressing gauze pads to both the entry and exit wounds, applying pressure. Blood soaked through immediately, hot and red. "I need someone to hold pressure while I prepare instruments." The sergeant stepped forward without hesitation, placing his large calloused hands over hers on the wound. "Show me." Liesel positioned his hands correctly, feeling the warmth of them, the strength. Then she pulled away and quickly began preparing her surgical kit, cleaning instruments in alcohol with rapid, efficient movements. "What's your name?" the sergeant asked suddenly. Liesel glanced up, surprised by the question in the middle of this crisis. Liesel Brenner." "Sergeant Thomas Clark," he said. "Boston." He nodded toward the unconscious man on the table. "That's Private First Class Robert Mitchell, Oklahoma City. He's been with my squad since Normandy." Good kid. Writes to his wife every day. His voice cracked slightly. Has 2 daughters. Emma's 5. Alice just turned 2. Liesel didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe to remind her that this bleeding man wasn't just an enemy soldier, but a person, a father, a husband, as if she needed reminding. She'd learned that lesson 3 years ago with the first 18-year-old boy who died in her arms, calling for his mother in a language she barely understood. I will do what I can, Liesel said quietly, her hands working automatically, cleaning, preparing, organizing. She worked quickly, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Clean the wound, check for debris there, a fragment of uniform fabric driven in by the bullet. Remove it. Check for bone damage. The collarbone was cracked but not shattered. Lucky, but the lung was damaged. Air bubbled in the blood. Tension building in the chest cavity. She needed to release it, seal it, give him a chance. Around her, the American soldiers watched in tense silence. The German wounded watched too, confusion and fear on their faces. What was happening? Why was their nurse treating the enemy? Liesel packed the wound, carefully stitched what could be stitched with thread that had been boiled and reboiled until it was starting to fray. Her sutures were small, precise, the kind that would heal cleanly if, when he survived. She bandaged tightly, sealing the chest, preventing air from escaping or entering where it shouldn't. Her hands moved with a confidence her mind didn't feel. Minutes passed, 10, 15, 20. Finally, she stepped back, her hands covered in blood. American blood now, not German. Was there even a difference? It looked the same, felt the same, smelled the same. Mitchell's breathing had steadied, still shallow, still concerning, but no longer that terrible wet rattle. His color was gray and waxy, but he was alive, probably. He needs a real hospital, Liesel said, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves. Surgeons, blood transfusion, antibiotics, penicillin if you have it. The wound will infect otherwise. She met Thomas's eyes. I have done what I can, but it may not be enough. Thomas nodded slowly. You've given him a chance. That's more than he had 10 minutes ago. He paused. Thank you. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Liesel didn't know how to respond. She nodded and turned to wash her hands in a basin of water that had gone pink with blood. As she dried them on a towel that had once been white, she heard Thomas give orders in English. She didn't catch all the words, but the meaning was clear. Secure the hospital post guards radio for medical evacuation. Then Thomas turned back to her, and she noticed what she should have seen before. He was swaying slightly, his face had gone even paler, and fresh blood had seeped through his fingers where they pressed against his side. You are wounded, Liesel said, medical training overriding everything else. It's nothing, Thomas said, but his voice was tight with pain. It is not nothing. Liesel stepped toward him, and for a moment she forgot he was the enemy, forgot she was supposed to be afraid. She was a nurse and he was wounded, and that was all that mattered. Sit down. Let me see. Thomas hesitated, then nodded to his men. They lowered their rifles slightly, but remained alert. He moved to a chair and sat heavily, unbuttoning his jacket and shirt with clumsy fingers. When he pulled the fabric aside, Liesel could see the wound, a deep gash along his ribs, maybe 6 inches long. Not a bullet wound, shrapnel, probably from the same explosion that had killed their medic. It was bleeding steadily, but not arterially. It would need stitches, many stitches. This will hurt, Liesel warned, reaching for her supplies again. I've had worse, Thomas said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. Liesel cleaned the wound, her touch as gentle as she could make it given the circumstance. Thomas tensed, jaw clenched, but didn't cry out. She stitched quickly, her fingers sure, despite the surreal situation. Here she was, a German nurse sewing up an American sergeant, while soldiers from both sides watched in stunned silence. Why did you do that? Thomas asked suddenly. Why did you help Mitchell? Liesel paused in her stitching, then continued. He was dying. But we're the enemy. Liesel looked up at him, meeting his brown eyes directly. Are you? I am a nurse. He is a wounded man. Where is the enemy in that? Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. They told us German medical staff would be Nazis, he said quietly. True believers, that you'd refuse to help, maybe try to poison us. Liesel tied off a stitch, reached for another. And what did they tell us about Americans? What did they tell you? That you would execute us on sight. She met his eyes again. That you consider medical personnel collaborators. That you show no mercy. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then almost to himself, looks like they lied to both of us. Liesel pressed a bandage against his side, taping it in place. There, done. You need rest and clean bandages tomorrow. Try not to move too much. Thomas stood slowly, testing his movement. The pain was still there, she could see it in his face, but the bleeding had stopped. Thank you, Liesel Brenner, he said. It was the first time an enemy soldier had said her name with something that sounded like respect. Fragile peace. The immediate crisis over an awkward silence filled the hospital. American soldiers stood guard near the doors and windows. German wounded lay in their cots, watching with fearful, confused eyes. Two groups of enemies forced together by circumstance, neither quite sure what happened next. Dr. Friedrich broke the silence, speaking to Thomas in careful, formal English. We have 28 wounded German soldiers here, Sergeant. Some are critical. They need continued care. What will you do with us? Thomas looked around the room. Liesel could see the conflict on his face. These were enemy soldiers, men whose comrades had shot at him and killed his friends, men who wore the uniform of a regime that had started the bloodiest war in human history, but they were also wounded, helpless, no longer a threat. We'll secure the building, Thomas said finally. My men will guard it, but your wounded will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He paused, his jaw tight. We're not barbarians. Relief flooded Dr. Friedrich's weathered face. Thank you, Sergeant. But nobody leaves, Thomas added firmly. Nobody tries anything. Is that understood? Understood, Dr. Friedrich said quickly. We are medical personnel. We have no interest in combat. Thomas nodded, then turned to Liesel. His expression was complicated gratitude mixed with wariness, respect mixed with suspicion. Miss Brenner, he said, we have more wounded coming in. There was heavy fighting in the town. Our aid station was hit. He paused. We need help. Will you and Dr. Friedrich continue treating the wounded, all of the wounded? Liesel glanced at the German soldiers in their cots, then at Robert Mitchell lying unconscious on the table, then back at Thomas. The choice was both simple and impossible. She had already crossed a line when she saved Mitchell. There was no going back now. Yes, she said, we will help. But before Thomas could respond, a voice cut through the room. The hell we will. Everyone turned. Private Jackson Young, maybe 23, with angry eyes and a rifle held too tightly, stepped forward from his position by the door. Sir, he said, his voice hard, with respect, this is bullshit. These are Nazis. They're the ones who, his voice cracked. My brother died at Normandy, shot by German soldiers, and now we're going to let them treat us, trust them with our lives. The tension in the room spiked instantly. German soldiers shrank back. American hands moved toward weapons. Thomas's expression hardened. Stand down, Private. Sir, I can't. That's an order, Jackson. Thomas's voice carried the weight of command now. These are medical personnel. They're protected under the Geneva Convention. They've already helped save Mitchell's life. You will treat them with respect. Jackson's jaw worked fury and grief warring on his young face. They're still the enemy, sir. Yes, Thomas said quietly. They are. But right now, they're also doctors and nurses doing their jobs. The war will end soon, Jackson. When it does, we need to be able to say we behaved with honor. Do you understand? For a long moment, Jackson didn't respond. Then reluctantly, yes, sir. But as he stepped back to his position, his eyes found Liesel's. The hatred there was clear and undisguised. Liesel felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas might trust her. Dr. Friedrich might believe in mercy and Geneva Conventions. But Private Jackson believed in revenge. And he was watching her, Over the next 3 hours, more wounded Americans arrived. Some walked with help, others were carried on improvised stretchers. They'd been caught in a mortar attack while clearing the town. Shrapnel wounds, broken bones, burns. The small field hospital became a strange, tense place that afternoon. Liesel and Dr. Friedrich worked alongside Corporal Bennett, a medic from Kansas, with quiet eyes and gentle hands. Margaret assisted her earlier prayers, replaced with efficient competence. German wounded lay in cots next to American wounded. Both sides watched each other with suspicion and curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of confused understanding. Liesel moved from patient to patient, treating injuries without seeing uniforms. A shattered ankle on a boy from Iowa, a burned hand on a German soldier from Cologne, a head wound on a corporal from Texas, a bullet graze on a teenager from Munich. Pain was pain, blood was blood, suffering was suffering. She was bandaging the Iowa boy's ankle when he spoke to her in halting textbook German. "Danke," he said. "Thank you." Liesel looked up surprised. "Your German is good." He smiled weakly. "My grandmother was from Hamburg. She taught me before." His smile faded. Before she died in the bombing raids. Liesel felt the familiar weight settle in her chest. "I am sorry." "Me too," he said quietly. "I'm sorry about all of it." Liesel finished his bandage in silence, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. Across the room she saw Thomas watching her. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. And in that moment, standing in a field hospital that smelled of blood and disinfectant and fear, surrounded by enemies who were helping each other survive, Liesel. Brenner wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve more death. But that thought died 3 days later when Major Patterson arrived with the photographs from Dachau, and everything changed again. Cracks in the wall. 5 days passed, 5 strange suspended days where the war seemed to exist somewhere else beyond the walls of the Pfaffenhofen Field Hospital. Outside, Germany was collapsing. Cities burned, armies disintegrated. The Third Reich's thousand-year dream was dying in rubble and ash. But inside the converted schoolhouse, something unexpected was happening. German nurses worked alongside American medics. Enemy soldiers lay in adjacent cots, no longer quite enemies, not yet friends, but something in between. The rigid lines of war were blurring. Liesel found herself working most closely with Corporal Bennett, the Kansas medic. He was 26, quiet, with farmer's hands and kind eyes that had seen too much death. They communicated in a mixture of broken English, fragmented German, and hand gestures that would have been comical if the work weren't so serious. Bennett showed her how to properly administer the new American penicillin, a miracle drug she'd only read about in medical journals. She showed him German techniques for deep suturing and how to identify sepsis before it became fatal. On the 3rd day, when Liesel couldn't find a vein for an IV on a dehydrated German soldier, Bennett stepped in with his steadier hands. On the 4th day, when Bennett struggled to lift a heavy American patient, Liesel helped without being asked. Small moments, tiny bridges built across an ocean of hate. The patients noticed. Werner, an 18-year-old German soldier with both legs in casts, started teaching Private Mitchell, now conscious and recovering, how to play chess, using pieces carved from scrap wood. They couldn't speak each other's languages, so they communicated through gestures and laughter. Margaret made herb tea every evening, serving it to everyone in mismatched cups. The Americans called it mystery tea and joked about its strange taste, but they drank it anyway. It became a ritual, a moment of peace in the chaos. Even Private Jackson, despite his simmering resentment, grudgingly accepted treatment from Dr. Friedrich when a wound on his arm showed signs of infection. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Radio reports spoke of Berlin surrounded, Hitler's bunker under siege, unconditional surrender inevitable. Maybe that knowledge made it easier to see each other as human. When the fight is nearly over, hatred becomes exhausting. But Liesel noticed something else too. She noticed the way Thomas Clark stayed at the hospital long after his duties required. His unit had moved on to chase the retreating German forces, but he'd been left behind because of his wound, tasked with managing this strange pocket of peace. She noticed how he watched her work, how he made excuses to check on patients near wherever she was, how their conversations grew longer each evening. Night conversations. It was the sixth night when Liesel found Thomas sitting outside the hospital, his back against the wall, smoking a cigarette and staring at the stars. She should have gone to bed. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours, but something made her walk outside instead. "Can't sleep?" she asked in English. Thomas looked up, not quite startled. "Never can, really. Not since Normandy." He gestured to the space beside him. "Join me." Liesel hesitated, then sat, leaving a careful foot of space between them. They sat in silence for a moment. The night was cool and clear, stars brilliant in the absence of city lights. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, but distant now, moving away. The war rolling eastward, leaving them behind. "Tell me about Boston," Liesel said finally. Thomas smiled slightly. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Something that is not war." So he told her about his family's construction business, about his neighborhood in Dorchester, about Sunday dinners with his mother's cooking and his father's terrible jokes, about his younger brother Patrick, who played harmonica and dreamed of being a musician. "Played," Thomas corrected himself, his voice going flat. "Past tense." Liesel felt the weight of that single word. "I am sorry." "Onzio," Thomas said, taking a long drag on his cigarette. "Killed in the landing. He was 19, never got to see Rome, never got to go home, never got to do anything but die on a beach for—" He trailed off. "For what? I don't even know anymore." Liesel understood that feeling, the senselessness of it all. "I had a brother too," she said quietly. "Stefan, he was 19 also." "Was?" Thomas looked at her. "He died 6 months ago." Liesel wrapped her arms around herself. "In the war. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. Stefan had died because of the war. She just didn't specify how. Didn't mention the Gestapo, the interrogation, the cell where he died alone, beaten and broken for the crime of speaking truth. Some truths were too painful. Some truths could wait." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and she could hear that he meant it. "That's the thing they don't tell you, isn't it? Both sides are bleeding. Both sides are losing brothers." "Yes," Liesel whispered. They sat in silence again, but it was different now, comfortable, shared. "You're not what I expected," Thomas said after a while. "When we came through that door, I expected, I don't know, hardened Nazis, true believers, people who'd spit at us or refuse to help." "And I expected monsters," Liesel admitted. "Americans who would shoot first and ask questions, never. The propaganda was very specific about what you would do to us." "Propaganda," Thomas said bitterly. "Yeah, we got that too. Funny how both sides lie to make the other seem inhuman. Makes it easier to kill people if you don't think of them as people." Liesel turned to look at him. In the starlight, his profile was sharp, strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that had seen too much but hadn't gone dead yet. "But we are people," she said. "Yeah," Thomas agreed. "We are." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Two people from different worlds, different languages, different sides of history's bloodiest divide, finding unexpected common ground in the ruins. Thomas looked away first, stubbing out his cigarette. "I should let you get some sleep. You've been working all day." "So have you. Force of habit. Sergeant's job never ends." He stood, offered her his hand to help her up. Liesel took it. His hand was warm, callous, steady. "Thank you," she said, "for talking with me, for treating us like people." "Thank you for saving Mitchell's life," Thomas replied, "and for reminding me that the enemy isn't always what they tell you it is." He walked back inside, leaving Liesel standing under the stars, her hands still warm where his had been. She didn't know it then, but that was the last peaceful moment she would have. Jackson's confrontation. The next morning, Thomas was checking supply inventories when Private Jackson found him. "Sir, can I speak with you privately?" Thomas looked up from his clipboard. Jackson's face was tight angry. "What is it, Private?" Jackson glanced around, then lowered his voice. "It's about the German nurse, Brenner." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "What about her?" "I saw you last night, sir, sitting with her, talking, laughing even." Jackson's voice had an edge. "Sir, with all due respect, you're getting too close. That's not your concern, Private. It is my concern when my commanding officer is fraternizing with the enemy." Jackson's voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself, lowered it again. "Sir, my brother died at Omaha Beach. German machine guns cut him down in the surf. He was 22 years old." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I remember. You told me. Then how can you sit there with her like she's your friend, like she didn't serve the regime that killed Mike, that killed your own brother?" Thomas set down his clipboard carefully. "Jackson Liesel Brenner is a nurse. She wasn't at Normandy. She wasn't the one shooting at your brother or mine. She's been conscripted into medical service, and she's been treating our wounded with the same care she gives German soldiers." "For now," Jackson said. "What happens when the war's really over, sir? What happens when there's no more benefit to helping us? You think she won't remember which side she was on? She saved Mitchell's life. And maybe that was just smart thinking. Keep us happy, keep us from executing her staff. Survival instinct, not mercy." Thomas felt anger rising. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jackson stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Sir, I've been watching. She's good at her job, I'll give her that. But she's still German. She still served the Nazis for 3 years. She still helped their soldiers go back to fight, to kill our guys. How many Americans are dead because she patched up Germans who went back into battle?" The question hit harder than Thomas wanted to admit, because it was one he'd been avoiding asking himself. "That's not fair," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Fair!" Jackson's laugh was bitter. "None of this is fair. Mike dying at 22 wasn't fair. Your brother dying at Anzio wasn't fair. But it happened, and the people on that side," he jerked his thumb toward the hospital ward, "they were part of it. Whether they pulled triggers or bandaged the people who did, they were part of the machine." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to defend Liesel, to explain that she was different, that she'd made choices in impossible situations, that not everything was black and white. But Jackson's words had planted seeds of doubt. "Stand down, Private," Thomas said finally. "That's an order." Jackson stared at him for a long moment, then snapped a salute. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, then paused. "I hope you're right about her, sir. I really do. But if you're wrong," he shook his head. "People like her, they're the reason the camps existed. They looked away. They did their jobs and didn't ask questions, and millions died." He left Thomas standing alone with his doubts. The camp. Major Patterson arrived the next afternoon in a jeep that kicked up clouds of dust. Liesel was changing bandages on Werner when she heard the vehicle pull up. Through the window, she saw a grim-faced officer in his 40s step out carrying a manila envelope. He spoke with Thomas for several minutes outside. Liesel couldn't hear the words, but she could see Thomas's body language change, shoulders tensing, head dropping, hand coming up to his face. When Patterson handed him the envelope and drove away, Thomas stood there for a long time just holding it. Then he opened it. Liesel saw the moment it hit him. His face went white. His hands started shaking. He doubled over slightly, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. She set down her bandages and walked to the door. "Thomas, what?" He looked up at her, and the expression on his face stopped her cold. Horror, disgust, rage, grief, all mixed together in a way that made him look 10 years older. "They found a camp," he said, his voice hollow, "about 60 miles from here, a place called Dachau." Liesel's blood turned to ice. She'd heard rumors, whispers, things people said late at night when they thought no one was listening. But rumors weren't real, couldn't be real. Germany couldn't. Major Patterson brought photographs. Thomas continued. His hands were shaking so badly the envelope rattled. "He thought I should see, thought we all should see what we've been fighting against." "Thomas, do you want to see?" His voice was flat dead. Do you want to see what your country did? Look at them. He thrust the envelope at her. Look at what you served. With trembling hands, Liesel pulled out the photographs. The first one showed bodies, hundreds of them, piled like cordwood skeletal limbs, tangled together faces frozen in death. The second showed living prisoners, if you could call them living, walking skeletons in striped uniforms, hollow eyes staring at the camera with expressions beyond hope or despair. The third showed children, dead children, their tiny bodies arranged in rows. The fourth showed ovens, furnaces, metal stretchers for loading human bodies like firewood. Liesel's hands went numb. The photograph slipped through her fingers, falling to the ground. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she was seeing. They starved them, Thomas said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Worked them to death, executed them, burned them, Jews mostly, but also political prisoners, disabled people, Roma, anyone the Nazis decided wasn't worth living. I didn't know, Liesel whispered. I swear I didn't know. Thomas's voice rose. How could you not know? It was your country, your government. You served them for 3 years. I was in field hospitals. I treated wounded soldiers. I never went to those places. But you heard rumors. You must have heard something. Liesel felt tears streaming down her face. Yes, I heard whispers, stories about camps in the east, about trains, about... Her voice broke. I didn't want to believe them. I told myself they were exaggerations, wartime propaganda. I told myself we couldn't be doing something so monstrous. You chose not to believe, Thomas said coldly, because believing would have required you to do something, to say something, to stop serving the people doing this. He was right. God help her, he was right. I'm sorry, Liesel choked out. I'm so sorry. Sorry, Thomas laughed, a horrible sound. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't erase the photographs. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you... He stopped, jaw clenched. I can't look at you right now. Thomas, please. I need to think. He turned away. I can't be here. He walked away, leaving Liesel standing alone with the photographs scattered at her feet like accusations. She looked down at them, at the children, at the bodies, at the proof of an evil so profound she had no words for it, and she realized that Thomas was right. She had known, maybe not the details, maybe not the full scope, but she had known something was terribly wrong, and she had looked away, because looking would have meant choosing, and choosing would have meant risking everything. Stefan had chosen. Stefan had spoken up, and Stefan had died. Liesel had stayed silent, had kept her head down, had told herself she was just a nurse, just healing people, just trying to survive, and while she survived, millions had died. The photographs blurred as tears filled her eyes. She sank to her knees, surrounded by evidence of her country's atrocity, and wept. The coldness. The hospital changed that day. The fragile peace that had been building shattered like glass. Thomas stopped speaking to the German staff. His orders were terse, professional, stripped of any warmth. When he had to coordinate with Dr. Friedrich or Liesel, he did so through Bennett, using the corporal as a translator even for simple things. Jackson and several other American soldiers became openly hostile. Not violent, Thomas wouldn't allow that, but cold. They watched the German staff with undisguised contempt. The German patients felt it too. They shrank back into themselves, stopped trying to communicate with the Americans. The chess game stopped. The evening tea ritual ended. The hospital became what it should have been from the start, a place where enemies existed in forced proximity, held together only by necessity and guard rifles. Liesel went through her duties like a ghost. She worked mechanically, treating wounds without really seeing the patients. She didn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photographs, the children especially, their small bodies, their empty eyes. She had saved German soldiers. Some of them had probably gone back to guard those camps, to operate those ovens, to pull those triggers. Her hands, which had stitched and bandaged and healed, had been complicit in the machinery of genocide. "You must eat something," Margaret said on the second day, bringing Liesel a bowl of soup. Liesel shook her head. "I can't. You'll make yourself sick." "Maybe I deserve to be sick." Margaret sat beside her, took her hand. "Child, what you're feeling, this guilt, it will not bring back the dead." "But maybe it should consume me," Liesel said bitterly. "Maybe that's what I deserve, to be eaten alive by the knowledge of what we allowed." "We did not allow it. We did not know. We knew enough." Liesel pulled her hand away. "We knew enough to ask questions. We knew enough to demand answers. But we didn't. We just kept working, kept living, kept pretending everything would be fine if we just didn't look too closely." She thought of Stefan again. Stefan, who had looked closely, who had asked questions, who had paid the price for his courage. "My brother was brave," Liesel said quietly, "and I was a coward." Margaret had no answer to that. The letter that night, unable to sleep, Liesel sat at the small desk in the nurse's quarters with a piece of paper and a pencil. "Dear Stefan," she wrote, "you were right about everything. You said the regime was evil. You said terrible things were happening. You said we had to speak up no matter the cost. I told you to be quiet, to keep your head down, to think about survival instead of morality. And you refused. You spoke truth even when it meant death. You chose courage over comfort. I chose silence. Today I saw photographs of what our silence enabled. I saw the camps. I saw what happened to people while we looked away. I saw children, Stefan, dead children, burned bodies, walking skeletons. And I know that every soldier I healed, every German I sent back to the front was part of the machine that did this. I saved lives. But in saving them, how many others did I condemn? You died for your convictions. I lived by betraying mine. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that. I don't know if I should. But I know this, I won't let them take anything else from me. The war took you. The guilt took my peace. But I won't let it take my humanity. I can't change the past. I can't bring back the dead. But I can refuse to let evil win by making me evil too. I don't know what that means yet, but I'll figure it out. I love you, brother. I wish I had been as brave as you. Liesel. She folded the letter carefully. Then she took it outside, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner. The paper caught fire, burned bright and quick. She watched the smoke rise into the night sky, carrying her words to wherever Stefan was now. The letter was ash, but the promise remained. She couldn't change what she had done, but she could choose what she would do next. And 2 days later, when the truck arrived with wounded German prisoners, Liesel would face that choice in its most terrible form, because one of those prisoners would have a face she recognized, a face from her nightmares, the face of the man who had killed her brother. The truck arrived on the morning of the 10th day. Liesel was changing bandages on Werner when she heard the engine, a different sound from the usual supply vehicles, heavier, more urgent. Through the window she saw American soldiers jump from the truck bed, rifles ready, surrounding 4 men being pulled from the back. Even from a distance she could see blood. Prisoners, German prisoners, wounded. Dr. Friedrich hurried to the door as the Americans brought them in. Thomas followed, his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken to Liesel in 3 days, not since the photographs. 4 German POWs, announced Lieutenant Morrison, a young officer Liesel hadn't seen before. They were being transported to a camp when one of them tried to grab a guard's weapon. In the struggle, several got shot. He looked at Dr. Friedrich, then at Liesel. "They need medical attention. You'll provide it." It wasn't a request. Dr. Friedrich nodded quickly. "Of course, bring them to the examination area." The soldiers hauled the prisoners in. 3 were unconscious or semi-conscious. The 4th was awake, moaning in pain. Liesel moved forward automatically, her medical training overriding everything else. Assess the wounded, prioritize treatment, save lives. She approached the first man, reached to check his pulse, and froze. Time seemed to stop. She knew that face. Recognition. The prisoner was in his mid-30s with sharp features and cold blue eyes that were currently glazed with pain. His SS uniform had been stripped away, but Liesel could see the telltale tattoo under his arm where the blood-type marking would be. But it wasn't the tattoo that made her blood turn to ice. It was the scar, a thin white line across his left cheek from temple to jaw. She had seen that scar before, 6 months ago, in a stone building in Munich where the Gestapo kept their prisoners. Flashback, October 1944. The corridor smelled of fear and blood and human waste. Liesel's hands shook as she followed the guard. "Your brother," the man said flatly. "You have 5 minutes." Stefan lay on a cot in a cell barely large enough to stand in. His face was swollen, bruised, purple and black. Blood crusted his split lips. His breathing was shallow, labored. "Stefan," Liesel whispered, kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open. "Liesel, you shouldn't be here. I had to see you. I had to." Her voice broke. "What did they do to you? Ask questions." Stefan tried to smile, wince. "I didn't give them the answers they wanted." Footsteps in the corridor, heavy boots, a man's voice cold and precise. "Time's up. Move him to interrogation room 3. Liesel looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, tall, Gestapo uniform immaculate, a fresh scar on his left cheek, probably from a recent fight with a prisoner. "Please," Liesel begged. "He's my brother. He's just a boy. He didn't mean—" "Your brother is a traitor to the Reich," the man said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, "spreading defeatist propaganda, encouraging desertion. He'll be dealt with accordingly. You're going to kill him. I'm going to make him useful first." The man, she'd later learn his name was Karl Richter, gestured to the guards. "Take him." That was the last time Liesel saw her brother alive. 3 days later, she received notice that Stefan Brenner had died of pneumonia while in custody. Everyone knew what that meant. Now that same man lay on the examination table, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the abdomen, his life in her hands. Karl Richter, the man who had tortured and killed her brother. The dilemma. Liesel stood paralyzed, her hands frozen in midair, her mind screaming. Richter's eyes focused on her face. Recognition flickered through the pain. "Fräulein Brenner," he said in German, his voice weak, but with that same cold precision she remembered. A smile twisted his lips. What a unexpected reunion. "Still playing nurse, I see." The other German prisoners stirred at the familiar language, but Liesel barely noticed. All she could see was that face, that scar, those eyes that had looked at Stefan with such contempt. Dr. Friedrich appeared at her elbow. "Liesel, what's wrong?" She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Thomas stepped closer, his expression guarded. "Miss Brenner," Richter laughed, a wet pain sound. "She knows me. Don't you, Fräulein from Munich? I interrogated her traitor brother." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Stefan wasn't it. Such a weak little thing. Cried for his sister right before—" "Shut up!" The words came out of Liesel before she could stop them, low and venomous. Richter's smile widened. "Still angry about that? He was a traitor to Germany. He deserved—" "I said shut up." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Liesel. Dr. Friedrich's hand gripped her arm. "Liesel, what is he talking about?" "He killed my brother." Her voice was shaking, but the words were clear. 6 months ago, Stefan was arrested for speaking against the war. This man, she pointed at Richter, interrogated him, tortured him. Stefan died in his custody. Understanding dawned on Dr. Friedrich's face. Horror followed. Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Richter assessed the wound in his abdomen, then looked up at Liesel. "Well then, this is awkward." He coughed again. "I'm going to die without surgery, aren't I?" Liesel said nothing. "How poetic." Richter continued, his voice growing weaker. "Killed by the sister of a man I executed. There's a certain justice to it." "Stop talking," Lieutenant Morrison ordered, but Richter ignored him, his eyes locked on Liesel. "Go ahead, Fräulein. Let me bleed out. It's what I deserve, isn't it? What your precious Stefan would want." Liesel felt like she was drowning. Her mind was chaos images of Stefan's broken face, the photographs from Dachau, Robert Mitchell's daughters, her oath as a nurse, everything crashing together in a wave of rage and grief, an impossible choice. She could let him die. No one would blame her. He was Gestapo, a torturer, a murderer. The world would be better without him. She could finally have revenge for Stefan. All she had to do was nothing. Just walk away. Let him bleed out on the table. It would be justice, Doctor. Friedrich, lean close, whispered in German, "No one would blame you, child. God knows I wouldn't." Thomas stood watching from across the room, not ordering, not judging, just waiting, letting her choose. Liesel looked down at Richter, at the blood pooling beneath him, at the wound that would kill him in 20 minutes without intervention. She thought of Stefan, of his courage, of the last thing he'd said to her in that terrible cell. Don't let them make you like them, Liesel. Don't let them take your kindness. That's how they win. She thought of the children in the photographs, the ones Richter and people like him had murdered. She thought of what Thomas had said. You chose not to believe. You chose silence. If she let Richter die, she would be choosing that some lives had value and others didn't, choosing to be judge and executioner, choosing to become exactly what she hated. If I let you die, Liesel said quietly, I become like you. Richter's smile faded. You chose who deserved to live. Liesel continued, her voice gaining strength. You decided Stefan's life was worthless because he disagreed with you. You decided millions of lives meant nothing. She took a shuddering breath. If I make that same choice even against a monster like you, I'm no different. She turned to Dr. Friedrich. Get him on the table. I'll need to operate immediately. The room erupted. What? Jackson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You can't be serious. He's Gestapo. He killed your brother. I know what he is, Liesel said. Then let him die. He deserves it. Perhaps he does. Liesel met Jackson's furious gaze. But I'm not a judge. I'm not an executioner. I'm a nurse. That's all I can be. If I start choosing who deserves life and who deserves death, I become everything I hate. Your brother, my brother, died fighting for decency. Liesel's voice cracked. He died because he refused to let hatred win. If I let this man die out of revenge, Stefan's death means nothing. Jackson looked at Thomas. Sir, you can't allow this. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, stand down, Private. But sir, I said stand down. Thomas's voice was firm. He looked at Liesel and something in his expression had changed. The coldness was gone. In its place was something like respect. It's her choice to make. The surgery, they moved Richter to the operating table. He'd lost consciousness now, which made it easier. Liesel didn't think she could operate while he was awake, while those cold eyes watched her. Her hands shook as she scrubbed them. She could feel everyone watching, the Americans with confusion and anger, the Germans with shock, Dr. Friedrich with concern, and Thomas, always Thomas standing by the door, his expression unreadable. Liesel approached the table, looked down at the man who had killed her brother. Don't let them make you like them. She took a deep breath and began. The bullet had torn through the lower abdomen, nicking the intestine. She had to remove the damaged section, reconnect the healthy tissue, clean the peritoneal cavity. It was delicate work made more difficult by the way her hands trembled. Halfway through, Richter regained consciousness. His eyes opened, focused on her face. Your brother, he said, his voice a rasp, screamed for you. Did you know that? Liesel's hands stopped. Every muscle in her body tensed. Called your name while I worked on him. Liesel, help me. Richter smiled through the pain. But you didn't come. You let him die alone. The scalpel shook in Liesel's hand. One slip, just one slip, and a hand settled gently on her shoulder. Thomas. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The touch was enough. A reminder that she wasn't alone, that someone understood the impossible choice she was making. Liesel took a breath, steadied her hands, continued the surgery. Richter kept talking, trying to provoke her, describing Stefan's interrogation in clinical detail. Every blow, every scream, every moment of her brother's suffering. Liesel stitched and cut and repaired, tears streaming down her face, her vision blurring but her hands steady, because this was the difference between her and him. He inflicted pain deliberately. She healed even when it destroyed her to do it. After 2 hours, it was done. Richter would survive. Liesel stepped back from the table, stripped off her blood-soaked gloves, and walked outside. She made it 3 steps before she collapsed against the wall and vomited. The conversation. She was still shaking when Thomas found her. He handed her a canteen of water. She rinsed her mouth, her hands still trembling. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. Liesel looked up at him. "Because if I had killed him with my silence, I'd be no different than the people who stood by and let the camps happen. Even knowing what he did to your brother, especially knowing that," Liesel's voice broke. "Stefan died fighting for what was right, for decency, for humanity. If I let my hatred win, if I let revenge make me a murderer, then his death was for nothing." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said finally, "about you, about what I said after the photographs." "You were right," Liesel said bitterly. "I was complicit. I looked away. You were surviving in an impossible situation," Thomas interrupted. "And yes, maybe you should have done more. Maybe we all should have. But what you just did in there," he shook his head, "saving the man who murdered your brother because it was the right thing to do even though it's tearing you apart." He paused. "That's the most courageous thing I've ever seen." Liesel couldn't speak, couldn't process his words through the storm of emotions. "When I saw those photographs," Thomas continued, "I thought all Germans were guilty. I thought anyone who served the Reich was complicit in the evil. And maybe that's true in a way. Maybe we're all complicit when we look away from horror." He sat down beside her. "But you didn't look away just now. You looked directly at your worst nightmare, and you chose mercy. You chose humanity." He looked at her. "If someone like you can make that choice, then maybe there's hope for all of us." "I don't feel hopeful," Liesel whispered. "I feel broken." "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "Me too. I think we're all broken. The war broke all of us." He paused. "But maybe broken people can still choose to do the right thing. Maybe that's all any of us can do." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, 2 broken people in a broken world trying to find meaning in the ruins. Inside, Karl Richter lived. He would stand trial later, would face justice for his crimes, but he would live. And Liesel Brenner, who had every reason to let him die, had chosen mercy instead. It was the smallest of victories, but maybe it was enough. Aftermath. Over the next days, something shifted in the hospital. The Americans, even Jackson, looked at Liesel differently, not with hostility anymore, but with a kind of awed respect. She had done something they couldn't comprehend, had chosen principle over vengeance in a way that shamed their own anger. Thomas spoke to her again. More than spoke, they talked for hours about what came next, about how to build something better from the ashes, about whether forgiveness was possible or even necessary. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The wounded were gradually evacuated. Robert Mitchell, strong enough to travel now, came to say goodbye. "I'll never forget you," he said, gripping Liesel's hand. "I'm going to tell my daughters about the German nurse who saved their daddy, about the woman who chose mercy, even when the world gave her every reason to choose hate." "Be well," Liesel said, her throat tight. "Love your family. That's the best thanks you can give me." Werner left. Bennett left. The German wounded were sent to processing camps. Finally, only a skeleton staff remained. Thomas's orders came on a warm May morning. He would rejoin his unit, then eventually go home to Boston. He found Liesel in the empty ward, cleaning instruments one last time. "I'm leaving today," he said. "I know." They stood awkwardly, 2 people who had become something like friends in the strangest of circumstances. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "After all this?" "I don't know," Liesel admitted. "Continue nursing, I think. Try to help rebuild. Try to—" She struggled for words. "Try to be worthy of Stefan's memory." "You already are," Thomas said. He held out his hand. Liesel took it, and he pulled her into a brief, tight hug. "Thank you," he said into her hair, "for reminding me that people can choose to be better than their worst moments." "Thank you," Liesel replied, "for giving me the chance to make that choice." He pulled back, looked at her seriously. "You're going to be okay, Liesel Brenner. People like you who choose right over easy, who save lives even when it destroys you. The world needs people like you." Then he was gone, walking into the sunshine, leaving Liesel standing in the empty hospital that had been a temporary island of humanity in an ocean of hate. In 1946, 1 year later, Liesel worked at a hospital in Munich. The city was rubble and reconstruction wounds and slow healing. She treated everyone who came through the doors: former Wehrmacht soldiers, displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, Allied soldiers, still stationed in the occupation. Some days were harder than others. Some patients brought back memories that made her hands shake. But she kept working, kept healing, kept choosing humanity. She received a letter from Robert Mitchell in the spring. His daughters were growing up healthy. He'd told them the story of the German nurse who saved him. "You taught me," he wrote, "that enemies can choose to see each other's humanity. I'm teaching my girls the same thing." She kept the letter. In the fall, Thomas visited while touring Europe with his wife. They drank coffee in a cafe that had somehow survived the bombing, talking about futures instead of past. "Do you still think about it?" he asked. "About that day with Richter?" "Every day," Liesel admitted. "I still don't know if I did the right thing." "Yes, you do," Thomas said. "You chose to be human when the world gave you permission to be a monster. That's always the right thing." Liesel smiled a real smile, the first in a long time. "Maybe." As Thomas left, he turned back one more time. "By the way, Mitchell's youngest daughter asked what your name meant in German. I looked it up." "Oh, Liesel. It means pledge to God, or sometimes oath." Liesel felt tears prick her eyes. An oath. That's what she'd taken as a nurse, what she'd upheld in the darkest moment of her life. "Yeah," she said softly, "I suppose it does." Years later, when young nurses asked for her advice, Liesel would tell them about April 1945, about the choice she'd made to save the man who killed her brother. "Medicine isn't about politics or sides," she would say. "It's about seeing humanity even in monsters, especially in monsters. Because the moment you decide some people don't deserve care, you become what you hate." She would tell them about a war that tried to destroy her humanity and how she'd fought to keep it. She would tell them about Thomas Clark, who gave her the space to make an impossible choice. And she would tell them about Stefan, whose courage in death had taught her about mercy in life. The war took everything from Liesel Brenner, her brother, her innocence, her peace. But it couldn't take her choice to be human, and in the end, that choice was enough.